Welcome to Deep Focus, a radio show about movies and New Haven. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm joined today for the first time in a while, not because of anything he's done, but because I've been so busy with reporting and not busy watching movies. I'm joined by my colleague, Appel.
Hello, Tom. Movies live.
Movies live. There are still movies happening, and we are still seeing them. We haven't done this in probably 5 or 6 weeks. It's been...
I know we tried a couple of times, but there's always a parking issue or a new place opening up or an accident on the corner.
And sometimes accidents involving historic buildings. If
That's
you've
right.
been following Alan's Historic District Commission coverage, not to get too deep in the weeds in the Independent, but today we're resuming our movie chatter for the last time of 2018. This will be the last episode of 2018, and we're going to be talking about The Favorite, the new historical costume drama and comedy, and probably a whole bunch of other genre descriptors we could use to describe it. But this is from Greek director Yorgos Lanthimos, following up on The Lobster, and there's another English language movie that he did somewhat recently that I'm blanking the name of. But
Dogfoot?
He did Dogtooth.
Dogtooth
and Alps. Those are two of his kind of stranger and more beloved by me Greek films. But now he has entered into kind of American mainstream cinema culture, working with some very big-name actors, Colin Farrell and Rachel Weisz, in previous outings. And here we have Olivia Colman, Rachel Weisz, and Emma Stone forming the central trio in this early 18th century British palace intrigue, where we have Queen Anne, played by Olivia Colman, who is, I don't think you can quite say that she is leading her country in its war against France, but those two things are certainly happening in parallel. Her country is at war in France, and she is enjoying the splendor and just the incredible opulence of her palace lifestyle, while also having to make some decisions about how to run the country and run the military. And meanwhile, her closest confidant, Sarah Churchill, played by Rachel Weisz, is battling it out with a new kind of ingenue who is eyeing for that second-in-command spot, played by Emma Stone. That character's name is Abigail Hill. And the movie plays out as a kind of a love triangle, as a palace intrigue, and as a very ribald and sometimes anachronistic costume drama. But Alan, let's just go for what do you think of the movie? You've probably seen a lot of again costume dramas in your time, but this one is not quite like other ones. And even though it strives for historical authenticity in the story, which oddly enough is very close to what actually happened from what I understand, and in the costumes and in the setting, the language is not always early 18th century
No.
British parlance. But what do you think of this movie?
Well, one of my favorite movies of all time is Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. And
An
so,
excellent parallel for this. Ooh, I didn't think
right,
about
because for the opening moments of this movie, you see the the Emma Stone character Abigail Hill, a kind of as you termed her, an ingenue, is a young woman coming to the palace, and she's riding in a crowded wagon, and she gets treated badly, and she gets thrown out, and there's poop along the road, and she arrives with her presenting her letter to get a job at the great palace.
It's a disillusioning experience for her.
Yeah,
in
but
the
you're
opening scene.
rooting for her just the way you rooted for Ryan O'Neal in the wonderful Kubrick film, where he's like a poor kid going to make his way in the world, and he's a kind of what do you call it? Not Ferris Bueller, but what's the Tom Hanks film? Excuse me, the guy who's at all the historical events.
Oh, Forrest Gump.
He's the kind of Forrest Gump of the 18th century. The problem, though, is you really are rooting for Ryan O'Neal, and very quickly, the Emma Stone character becomes somebody just as disagreeable in her power grabbing and her greediness. And
just as Ryan O'Neal, because let's not forget how Barry Lyndon plays out. He is not a sympathetic character in that movie, right? He
uses people. He's definitely a cad, but he retains his humanity. I think so. My beef with this film is that there's no there's no refuge from the amorality of all the characters, and actually, I just love those kind of episodic early 18th century novels. At one time, I was going to be I'm a kind of scholar Monkey, Richardson, and these writers.
Thackeray was.
Thackeray's a little later, but Clarissa by Richardson and a guy named Smollett. These guys wrote wonderful stories where, even though the characters act like cads as they're moving through the world, there's a really realistic sense of how creepy everything is. But you kind of are rooting for them, and I just found this film. I was going to say it lost its way, but I don't think it lost its way. I don't think its intention was ever to work on a broad canvas and to move through time. Quite the contrary. The movie feels to me claustrophobic. You never get a sense of what Queen Anne is really dealing with. Everybody is treated poorly, really poorly, and I don't know. What for me. What made me keep watching the movie to some extent was just the visual pleasure of it. They just spent so much time on the kind of Downton Abbey complex, and you just wanted to see how they're going to up the ante with the next visual.
I think that is also a very appropriate parallel to the entire filmography of Stanley Kubrick, but Barry Lyndon in particular, which was infamously lit entirely with candles. Right, there was no artificial lighting that Kubrick used. He's trying to use lighting that was natural and appropriate to the world that the main character Barry Lyndon would have actually lived in. And there certainly is a lot of candlelight in The Favorite as well, especially some of the darker interior scenes where
right. And Lanthimos loves the candles, and he loves when they go out finally.
The suddenness with which you can turn off a candle with a quick blow. There's a wonderful scene where Emma Stone is in a room where she's maybe not supposed to be. And two other characters come in and are engaging in something that she's not supposed to see, and she just blows out the candle, and all of a sudden, visually, I mean, in the frame, we don't see her there. We know she's there, but the screen goes dark, and that's something that candles do pretty beautifully in this type of historical.
I think if you interviewed Lanthimos, he would say he studied Barry Lyndon, and I think the movie is obsessed with the details of daily life of the 18th century, how crap was everywhere, how it was very hard to bathe. How many people were required to staff those kitchens. Mm-hmm.
There's nothing glamorous about gout in this movie, and gout plays quite a big role. And, it sounds like we saw the same movie in that I think so. But I think that my response was quite a bit different in that I didn't see this as a presentation of characters who are too aggressively cynical or hateful or motivated by something that I don't want to spend 2 hours thinking about. I saw actually a pretty sensitive portrait of people at the highest rungs or proximate to the highest rungs of social and political power in this particular historical moment. And each of the three main characters gets a chance to exert power over the other two at one point. Even the queen, even though the queen may have the most may technically be imbued with the most power and may be the most vulnerable because of her just the privilege that has kind of softened her mind, but each character knows how to wield power pretty brutally when they have it. And then I found myself rooting for the other two characters who were underneath the person in power, but those characters change so much over the course of the film. So I guess what to say, I think that
rooting for them, to have the power to be even nastier than their predecessor?
No, rooting for them to reclaim us, to get themselves out of the complete kind of humiliation and pain and deprivation that they find themselves when they're not in power, just because it's difficult to watch people struggling so much, whether, pushed into the mud or, dragged by a horse or whatever. I mean, there's quite a bit of suffering for the folks when they don't find themselves in the favor of the person in power, but also to recognize through the humbling experiences of, not being the person controlling the other two, to recognize that perhaps they should not be as cruel the next time. Now, I get that
there's no recognition scene there.
Arguably, I think the very end may present a little bit of hope, not necessarily towards one character thinking that she is going to act differently, but I mean, we see the Abigail character played by Emma Stone really, on the surface level, achieve everything that she hoped to achieve, and yet the pretty serious despair in her face in that final shot leads me to believe there's always a little bit more I can hope for with these characters, that they may recognize the indignities that they are subject to and that they subject others to, and maybe they will change sometime in the future.
Well, you remember W.H. Auden, those to whom evil is done do evil in return. No, I found I said to myself, why is this movie being made now? Sometimes there's a reason when producers sense there's a kind of zeitgeist out there, because I did a little quick research with Dr. Wikipedia, and this script has been around since 1998, according to Wikipedia, which may be true or may not be, but apparently they could not get funding at the time because, and we should mention this, like a big part of this movie is the lesbian relationships between the Queen and in fact the way to get to the Queen's ear, so to speak, is through her genitalia. There's a lot of lesbian stuff here, and apparently it was considered, too daring in the late 90s, but now it's okay. But but I think that's kind of neither here nor there. It's not like a kind of running the flag up for lesbian relationships are okay.
No, I wouldn't say that either.
It's using sex for power.
Without a doubt. And I do think that this...
And so the women are as bad as the men, if not worse.
Well, that's an interesting point. I don't know if I would quite agree with that, because I think that the women seemed, in this movie, the women seem to exist on a whole other like intellectual plane than the men. The men in this movie are the true kind of butts of every single joke, and that they are completely superfluous and also needlessly cruel and entitled.
Right.
The men here fill space for. There's a wonderful, if you remember the wedding night of the Emma Stone character, the way that she dispenses whatever marital obligations she has, so that she can continue,
her scheming.
Continue her scheming.
Right.
I think that one reason why this movie may be a more appropriate fit for 2018 is that the three female characters at the center of this movie, not whether they're in a lesbian relationship or not. This is a movie that really upholds like fascinating, complex, really strong, really difficult, really challenging women, which is something that the history of American cinema is not.
Well, yeah, but it's like
done.
5 steps back for feminism. I mean, if the point is women could be a woman striving for power could be as much of a bastard as a man, if not more. Why is and actually be more foul-mouthed? The men wear more makeup, it's true, and the women are more politically
It is important
conniving.
to be pretty. One of the
it's important to be very pretty, but I just don't understand why we should admire these people at all. To me, it's my only other thought about this film actually is that apropos of what we were saying earlier, why is its moment now? And I was thinking that it's very much Trumpian, because the whole the hub of the wheel around which all the conversations and all the scheming is, who can get the ear of the Queen, who can have more influence over the Queen, who's close to the Queen, and this is utterly
you have like
Trumpian.
A Steve Bannon, Steve Miller type relationship.
Substitute Steve Miller for Abigail and Bannon for
the
the
Rachel
other
Weisz
one.
character.
I mean, it just and the men need to go through the women in order to find out what the Queen is thinking.
And certainly the Queen in this is a lot less aggressively stupid than Trump. Trump is certainly performing a level of masculinity that Queen Anne does not have to do. In fact, she's much more content, performing that femininity where she kind of passes out when she doesn't want to have to deal with a problem in Parliament. I mean, there are certain gender expectations that she is able to play off of in order to get closer to whatever it is that she actually wants to be spending her time doing. But very quickly, to respond to the point about whether or not to admire these characters, I don't admire any of them, and I don't think you necessarily I don't admire a lot of characters in Stanley Kubrick movies. I can't think of a single one that would be a good role model for society, but I do think that there is a
you don't love Barry at all? The other characters?
No, I haven't seen the movie in a couple of years, but I think he winds up being one of the cruelest and most not interested in the welfare, just the most selfish characters I don't know, maybe his entire cinema, from what I remember.
Well,
doesn't he wind up shooting his son in a duel or something like that?
Oh, I don't remember that scene, but even the women that he uses and leaves kind of look at him at the doorway of the house as he rides off wistfully. I mean, I think the character from these 18th century novels is meant to be both criticized and admired in a kind of way that is a kind of realistic and humane way to look at most people. The problem with these characters, I keep on coming back to this, is that it seems to me that if there are admirable traits in these people, they seem to be sacrificed for the sake of making these almost political, dogmatic, or cultural points about the power of women. And I think that's what the movie tries to do. And I think to a great fault, because it loses the complexity of people. Even look at this queen. I mean, the real Queen Anne was not the dolt that comes through here. The real Queen Anne, it dawned on me this morning when I was consulting Professor Wikipedia. This woman had 17 pregnancies, hence the 17 rabbits that scurry around. Each rabbit, she had 12 stillborns or miscarries. Of her 5 children that lived, to be able to breathe, 4 died before the age of 2. She went through so much suffering, and there isn't an ounce of humanity that is deployed towards her by any character or the director. Not a moment.
Oh, I totally disagree. I think
really?
I think everything that you just said is revealed quite explicitly in a scene in the movie between the Queen and Abigail, kind of at the not the apex of her rise, but as she is most quickly accelerating towards being the favorite of the Queen. And I think there is quite a bit of sympathy, both from the director and from Abigail at that moment. Yes, Abigail is always thinking about what is best for her, what can most lead her to be safe. If you remember, again, a more explicitly articulated goal does not come through for Abigail than just she is striving for a certain level of safety and security that her previous station in life deprived her of it. Now, I get that she is needlessly cruel at times, but I do think what one of the key motivations for her character is something that I think is eminently identifiable for everyone: the need not to feel constantly threatened and preyed upon. And unfortunately, in this social and political structure that she has thrust herself in, but also that she exists in, the quickest way to safety is to make sure that there's a person under your foot. I don't think that's admirable, but I do understand, in the context that Lanthimos creates, why these, I think, pretty complex individuals make the decisions they make. And then we haven't even spoken about the whole level of kind of mannered and acerbic and deadpan wit. And
the dialogue.
But first, let me say you're listening to Deep Focus on WNHH LP, New Haven's home for community radio. I'm your host, Tom Breen, and I'm talking with Alan Appel about The Favorite, the new early 18th century historical costume drama comedy from Yorgos Lanthimos.
And we're nicer than all the people in that movie. You see, but even when Abigail, who's the new girl in town, because she's actually described by the other characters as very nice, very pleasant, which is like an astonishing new thing in court where everything is awful. But even when she has that moment when she meets the Queen, and the Queen introduces her 17 rabbits, and including her favorite Hildebrand, and Abigail knows that these probably represent her dead children. Her empathy is totally instrumental, and actually, because when she attains power, she almost kills one of the rabbits under her very fashionable boot when she's drunk and supposedly serving the Queen. So you understand why these characters are doing what they do, but the world that they inhabit is a world where sort of being a decent human being is going to be like your passport to death and not non-survival.
And in Lanthimos' other movies, from Dogtooth to Lobster, I think that heightened level of kind of deadpan dystopia is on full display. But I do think that, as heightened as it may be, that gets at a pretty core truth for how the world actually works, which is that there's no 100% pure empathy, and there's no 100% pure manipulation of them. I don't know, maybe there's more of that than there is 100. But, every person's actions is, a combination of a whole host of motivations, and hopefully more of them are in the direction of genuine care for other people. But I think it would be just not an accurate perception of how people interact to say that there isn't, to have some level of like utility in the back of your mind when you think about how you're acting towards someone, especially when you don't have a close personal relationship with it. When you're trying, you are trying to do something differently with your life, and you see someone who may be able to do that. I don't think that you need to act cruelly towards them, and I think that Lanthimos is pretty biting in how he describes that. Everyone is willing to do some pretty terrible things in order to get power, but I still think that gets at something that's pretty true about this uncomfortable mix of what actually motivates us, and just about any interaction, especially when we have to decide between, is it better to lie and flatter, or is it better to speak a cold and unforgiving truth to someone? The characters try those two things, and it works out with varying degrees of success.
Right. Well, and it seems to me that it really is a kind of a parable for the times, because the nastiness in the most elegant gold-lined chambers of the palace, it trickles down. In the scullery in the kitchen, the women are nasty to each other.
Yeah.
The whole household. It's not like Downton Abbey, although it shares Downton Abbey's love for material detail, but at least there were a lot of pockets of humanity, and then both nicer people below and nicer people above, but
not here.
But not here in this film. And I don't know. I guess I'm really bothered by. I ask myself, and this is a theme that has come up in our conversations before. When you have a movie that takes a big piece of history and kind of focuses it and angles it a certain way and tells a certain story, and that there's a huge distortion of history going on here, because England and Scotland were united under Queen Anne. She was very involved in politics. She was not, and where we have her in scenes in this film where she's so consumed by her pain and her gout, which require sex and herbs to cure her. She's woozy and dizzy and moving in and out of consciousness. So when her ministers are standing before her and they explain the battle that Sarah Marlborough's husband is about to engage in, one guy says to her, "And Your Majesty, this is France. This is our enemy." I mean, it suggests that the woman was a total self-indulgent dolt who played with rabbits and just like lesbian sex.
Yeah,
that's utterly contrary. Apparently, Lanthimos picked up Sarah Marlborough, her memoirs, after she was banned from court. She wrote these very nasty things, and apparently that was the material. But it goes contrary to. Apparently this queen attended more cabinet meetings than any other monarch before her. Was deeply involved in she created the United Kingdom, Scotland, and that's not the Olivia Colman character.
Right. No, that's a great point, and I think that also speaks volumes to perhaps a detrimental aspect of this portrayal of such a central female character towards what I was arguing before about how here we have three fascinating women at the center of a movie, and that in itself is a better fit for 2018 when we're thinking about the kind of historic injustices of representation. But nevertheless, I do still think that the movie can get away with showing a small chunk of Queen Anne's rule when she is maybe most debilitated by gout and by the kind of indolence that court encourages. But if that's not historically accurate, then yeah, that's something that we have to deal with. Is it unfair to the real Queen Anne? Probably.
Totally.
Is it a fine for whatever point Lanthimos is trying to make as a whole? I don't know. I guess that's the question you have to ask with
you're right.
historical movies.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting conversations we could have had, or might have actually, is I'm interested in what's her name, Sarah Rees Ronan as Mary Queen of Scots, another historical drama.
Saoirse Ronan.
How do you say her name?
Saoirse.
Saoirse. What kind of name is that?
Irish.
All right. Um,
But yes, she will
you
be
know
starring in something somewhat similar. Well, just another, but except she is a warrior queen.
Right, and it's also a costume drama, and it's also steeped in history, and it's interesting the uses to which they do that. I mean, Anthony Lane in the New Yorker, he mentioned that his view of this film. I mean, he appreciated it for some of the same reasons we do. I mean, the visual elegance of the thing, but he said for the people making this movie, historical reconstruction is pretty much of a game.
Yeah,
and I think that says it.
I think that's a pretty astute observation. Before we wrap up our conversation, I would be remiss if we didn't speak for a few minutes about the style of this movie, because Lanthimos is such a stylist. I mean, this is not a straightforward representation of, you know, what life might have been like in the early 18th century at this court. We have this, I think claustrophobic is a good word to use, because there's some pretty serious kind of camera or visual distortion going on, particularly in these long hallways in between chambers in the palace, where we have focused in the middle of the hallway, and then it's kind of like a fisheye view looking out towards the left and right, where everything just kind of warps off into oblivion. It seems like these are both the hallways go on forever, but also they seem to kind of circle in upon one another. There are a fair and then of course there are a lot of very quick camera pans where you're looking at one end of the room, and then all of a sudden the camera just turns 90 degrees abruptly, and we're looking at the other end of the room. And again, these are such spacious interiors that it gives us the sense of the opulence of it all, but also just the vastness of this maze that they've created for themselves, that they're constantly trapped in and can't escape. But it's easy to as one of these characters to think this is the entire world, because it's so big. There's so much money in it. There's so much glamour and books
and the world. Yeah, I was thinking.
And there's no mud inside.
Right. I was thinking of Barton. Was it Barton Fink? You know, those long the long hallway shots. You know, inside the mind of the screenwriter or whatever. It's almost as if the world of it's chamber within chamber, or world within world. I mean, and the innermost is the queen's bedchamber, and then there are the hallways, and then there's the outside of the palace where there are other people who are somehow almost creatures so different from the rest of us, from the rest of the royalty, that they're outside in the outer courtyard. One of the scenes that I thought was really bizarre is, you know, when Olivia Colman as Queen Anne gets overcome by her pain or by unhappiness or by and often by music. It seems to me, music.
Well, a reminder of children. I mean,
it's a reminder of children. She looks out the window and she sees a little chamber group playing, and they're playing. I think it's Handel's music, which is interesting because it turns out the real Queen Anne was subsidized Handel. Was his true patron and enabled him to write a lot of that stuff. Who knows? Maybe the Messiah we owe to Queen Anne. We don't even know. But she shrieks and she tells him to all shut up.
After initially losing herself kind of subconsciously to her enjoyment of the music. But then when, you know, all the baggage comes to the fore, she can't quite stand it. And I think that's also a big reason why she's so infatuated with sex with these younger women, right? They makes her feel happy, distracts her from the pain, both the emotional and the physical, and she will pursue it. And maybe that's a Trumpian thing as well,
right?
And kind of immediate gratification at all costs.
Yeah, but she emerges as quite a calculating person. She comes out of her wooziness, and she does quite know what's going on, and she, you know, like the current ruler of the White House, she's still in her own way very much in charge, which I think she was.
Every Lanthimos movie also has some element of horror to it. I think partly because the characters are so cruel and deliver their cruelty with such dispassion. It's kind of terrifying. But also, I think a big part of that horror element here is the music. And I didn't look up who the composer was, but I was struck by how well this movie builds tension in really throughout its entire 2-hour runtime, through something as simple as it just sounded like the plucking of a cello, or it wasn't some, you know, heavy foreboding synth music. It was just kind of this pizzicato, like dun 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 dun, that seemed historically appropriate for the string music that I guess Queen Anne was subsidizing or may have been listening to, but also very familiar to, like, you know, Halloween or whatever 1980s horror movie one most associates with kind of a theme that drills itself into the viewer's mind as they're waiting for something terrible to happen. And Lanthimos delivers on terrible things happening. This isn't a movie where, you know, the bloody parts happen behind doors. You know, we get to see the consequences of actions here.
What was your favorite horror episode in the film?
Honestly, it was, well, the first that comes to mind is just the way that Rachel Weisz's character is scarred at towards the end. Really, the physical embodiment of her fall from power, and the way that her presence just terrifies the queen, and ultimately how she has to cover herself up in a way that both obscures the immediate scar, but also makes her all the more menacing afterwards. There are probably plenty of more scenes where in the actual unfolding of the scene, I wasn't sure if something terrible was going to happen, but that seemed like a monster haunting the queen that the queen couldn't quite deal with.
When she falls off the horse, and as if that weren't bad enough, she gets dragged for like 10 minutes, and then
palaces and whorehouses seem to be the
yeah, and then she gets repaired by, you know, and those people in the bawdy houses are not a whit better than anybody else. It's a tough world, this Lanthimos world.
Would you recommend it?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think it's full of, I think it's full of interesting stuff. Although the characters often talk with the strange combination of, you know, 18th century novels and, you know, sort of bar talk.
And which I loved. I mean, same with, there's this bizarre, again, very fitting for Lanthimos movies where this happens really in every single one, but a very bizarre dance sequence at the middle of it, where we start out with some familiar courtly style of waltzing, and then all of a sudden they're like slam dancing and break dancing and
Russian kazatskas or something.
Right. It's not. It's there. It is not. And there's certain, you know, people drop the F-bomb, as it were, plenty of times in this, and I don't know if that is something that they were using back, but certainly there are plenty of other vulgarities that I can imagine being more historically appropriate. So, well, that is The Favorite playing downtown, and I think that this movie has gotten a fair amount of like award season buzz, particularly for Olivia Colman and Rachel Weisz and Emma Stone as their three lead performances. So don't be surprised if you hear more about this movie in the weeks and months ahead as movie people gear up for Oscars and Golden Globes and stuff. So it's nice to have such a weird movie in that conversation of best movies of the year. So Lanthimos, keep doing what you're doing. And Alan, Happy New Year, happy holidays. Thank you for being on the show when we're both able to make it to the studio. And I hope for another year of lots of movie discussions.
Let's go for Mary Queen of Scots next.
Oh, yes. I would love that.
All right. Thank you.
All right, listeners, you can go to deepfocusradio.com to find a recording of this conversation and many, many more. Please do check it out, and we will catch up with you in the new year for another episode of Deep Focus.